So basically, surrealism is a really, really broad topic. Um, so it began in 1924 through literature. So Andre Breton, this is him right here, um, his very cool glasses. He was known as the father of surrealism, and he was a French poet. Um, but surrealism is this sort of idea, and it's like an art movement. Um, it's really about sort of like merging ideas relating to psychology, the unconscious mind, and visual art, and using art as a way of expressing things that are invisible. Um, and I also just want to mention that, like, while art movements are kind of like times in history when lots of artists are doing similar things, exchanging ideas, and creating a movement that really affects the future. There's been artists making surrealist works for a very long time. Um, and also, I also want to mention that a lot of the time when we think about surrealism or a specific art movement, there's a few artists that come to mind, like Salvador Dali. We're not going to talk about Salvador Dali in this presentation, only because I think sometimes there's an oversaturation in art history about certain artists, when in reality, there were so many other artists doing really interesting things. But they were just a little bit more obscure, or weren't written about quite as much. And I think it's important to do a little bit more digging. Um, so Andre Breton was really sort of thinking about the unconscious mind as a means for revolution. So um, Breton was, and the Surrealism movement was really kind of like a post-World War response. Um, so it was a lot of artists thinking about the state of the world, um, but then also sort of looking inward, thinking about the state of the world and thinking about how can we look inward in order to improve the state. Um, so he was seeing the unconscious mind as a means for revolution. So he wrote this thing called the Surrealist Manifesto, um, and he defined surrealism as pure psychic automatism. So this idea of automatism is really about kind of like liberating the subconscious mind, um, using materials and tools in order to make something that's almost like an automatic flow from our unconscious mind onto the page. And it allows us to then look at it and um, analyze it and understand it a little bit more, kind of like a Rorschach test. And so this work over here, which is untitled, is a decalcomania, and he did a lot of writing about these kinds of works, which were really kind of like ink transfers, similar to a Rorschach test, where he would probably put ink on a piece of glass or a piece of paper and then press paper on top of it while it's still wet, and then pull it apart and see what it reveals. So it's really about embedding aspects of embedding more automatic or more unexpected aspects of the process into making a painting or a drawing that then allows us to think and imagine narratives and interpretations. Um, so um, the automatic or abstract surrealists were working a lot with these ideas of automatism, of how can I make marks with my hand, trying to maybe detach my conscious mind from what I'm doing, and then allow it to sort of unfold into a more recognizable world that we can then explore and interpret and navigate and come to understand in a new way. So this is a work by Juan Miró, um, and he did a lot of these paintings with these really rich sense of shape and line. There's also like characters emerging. They feel very like musical. While at the same time, they have a kind of like a Matisse sense of space, um, where this feels like very much like a room. There's a window, but the way in which he made them was so much about, or like what these are about is really about like the process of how he got there as well. So the process of allowing his hand to move through through the page with this sense of discovery and um, trying to almost not think while drawing, and then turn those drawings into paintings as a way of making them real, making something invisible visible. Here's a couple more by Juan Miro. Um, and so I just love his line work, as well as his, sometimes it seems like he uses stamps or really like unusual ways of making marks. Um, but he has this really beautiful sense of like the weight of a line or the weight of a shape in space. And here's a work by Roberto Matta, um, who was another abstract surrealist. Um, and his work, one reason why I love his work so much is how deep it is, how deep the spaces are, while at the same time they were created out of this really kind of like um, unexpected and fluid way of working, where he's allowing shapes to emerge on the page, but then he's using things like value and shape and color in order to push some aspects back in space and allow other forms to emerge in like a narrative. So to me, like these absolutely feel like they're like life forms that are like beaming with light or moving through this world. We also have these kind of like tentacle like or like coral like forms moving through space. And one thing that's really cool about, I think, the abstract surrealist movement, and what a lot of these artists are doing, is that light is important. So in like abstract expressionism, it's almost like light doesn't matter. It's like Jackson Pollock, um, it's like Jackson Pollock throwing paint at a page. It's about the action. It's about the paint sitting there, but it's not about light. But these abstract surrealists, they still were painting kind of like action painters, where they were being really, experimental, and it's almost like an athletic process of like moving across the canvas, um, and inventing these forms. But it seems to me like Roberto Matta, he decided where the light was going to be, and then he used that to inform the rest of his process. So he intentionally mixed up tones and pushed these darker tones into the background to allow these lights to sort of like emerge or glow. Um, so I think that when we think about abstraction, there's so many different ways we can think about making something abstract. What kind of gravity might exist in an abstract world? Does gravity matter in the painting you're making? Does light matter in the painting that you're making? For me, lighting is always very important in my work. So I'm kind of biased and always might push you to think about a light source. But there's so many ways to make a painting. But I agree that the sense of color is so vivid. And I think partially, these yellows and oranges and reds and greens feel so vivid because of the really complex brown tones that are almost like transparent and sort of like floating. It feels like these more vibrant tones are like emerging through like a misty, misty haze of some kind. Another abstract surrealist was Vasily Kandinsky, and he did a lot of thinking about painting as a way of capturing musical compositions or the feeling created by music. So one thing that we're going to do next week is we're going to do a little bit of like listening to music, and responding to it with paint, in order to like loosen ourselves up and really kind of just be in the moment and put paint and color to our page in response to something that we're feeling in the moment. And I chose these specific images because it shows how um, he worked in a variety of different ways. So this really fluid, almost impressionistic style of applying paint on the right, compared to the very sort of collage, like um, really sharp-edged forms on the left. I also love that you can really kind of imagine space in these. You know, this is really using flat shape, but I also feel like I could move through this image, and it's almost like Toby, Toby, sorry, Toby, please. It's almost like a portal into another world. Another artist, and this is I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. I've heard it pronounced just as Ashley or Arshley. I'm not quite sure. But Gorky was basically this artist that he was said to be at the tail end of Surrealism, or like the last Surrealist and the first abstract expressionist. So he was like kind of like a painter that was said to be, at least by art historians, kind of in between abstract Surrealism and abstract expressionism. Um, and so to me, I think his works really kind of encapsulate both, where they're very much about the texture, they're very much about the layers of color, and just like the way that the paint sits on the canvas, where we can just appreciate it for what it is physically, kind of like the abstract expressionisms, the abstract expressionists. But we can also imagine narratives in these. And to me, that's kind of like the main difference between the abstract surrealists and the expressionists, was kind of like, how are narratives being built versus how is just pure emotion being expressed. I believe this is oil paint, and you can see that, you know, the moments here, it almost looks like Gorky did a layer of reddish pink tone and then layered this black wash and oils on top. And while the oils were still wet, he took a rag with a bit of solvent on it and wiped away to create like this almost like hand-like structure right here. Or maybe it's another face. I don't know. It's very open to interpretation, which I think also adds to that effect of it sort of also functioning for the viewer as a way of like sort of like unlocking other parts of our brain, where it makes us think in new ways that are very specific to who we are individually. Here's another work by Gorky. Really interesting stuff. And another thing that a lot of these surrealists are thinking about, while they're thinking about like individual unconscious, they're also thinking about like these ideas of like the collective unconscious, so that making something physical that is otherwise invisible has these qualities that connect all of us unconsciously. But really beautiful to me, like they feel like it feels like a forest, or it also could kind of feel like architecture of some kind. Really vivid. But then again, there's like the abstract expressionism or abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock. These artists who were really about thinking about the canvas as like an arena for an action to happen. So it's way more about, you know, while the process is still important, like the abstract surrealists, for them it's so much about like the textures and the gestures created through the mode of just acting inside the arena of a canvas. And here's a work by Rothko, another abstract expressionist. Really beautiful stuff. But as contemporary artists, it's kind of a cool place to be, because we can kind of take and pick and choose from like the entire history of art to create images that are us, you know. Some people claim that like everything has already been done before, and to me that's great. It's just more an inspiration, and whatever we make with our own hands is going to be unique. So I also wanted to show y'all some Max Ernst. So now we're kind of moving from the abstract surrealist concepts of, you know, really working with more abstract forms that are very open to interpretation. Max Ernst is a surrealist that's kind of merging that with more rendered spaces. So this work titled Swamp Angel, um, to me, it really has a lot in common with that first decalcomania ink transfer we saw on the first slide in the textures, where it really appears like it's almost like a monotype where maybe he was painting on glass. He placed his canvas down that was really wet and peeled it back and allowed something to reveal itself. And then he built it into this space that has a clear light source. So there's, to me, it's clear that light is coming from over here. Clear moments of like figure and ground, foreground and background, foreground, middle ground, and background. While at the same time, it can be about the textures as well. It can be about this organic, unexpected, beautiful quality of the paint. Max Ernst is one of my very favorite painters. Here's a few more by Max Ernst. And I think that some of like the techniques that we looked at in class last week, I think it was last week, where, like putting some plastic on your canvas and letting it dry, letting your paint dry with some plastic on it for part of the process, can create some textures that are so organic that they can mimic the thing that we actually want to represent. So like if we want to represent coral and we take a sponge and allow a sponge full of paint to like, seep into the canvas overnight and then see what happens, it might look just like the coral that we're trying to paint. So I love that his work really does both, where he's rendering, has control, and he's rendering with the sense of light and shadow, but he's also allowing the materials to do unexpected, beautiful things that really kind of like add to this otherworldly quality. Here's another work by Max Ernst. This one has a little bit less texture, a little bit more of like a smooth painting, but I just love these, sorry. I love the details in this, like, it's almost like a cart moving on this edge right here. Also, a lot of these surrealists are doing a lot of kind of like thinking about one object as multiple things. So like this, it looks like a thing of like a piece of lettuce or like cabbage or some sort of plant, but it also has a hand reaching out and grabbing a fruit. It also feels like it has like a face. It feels like it's moving through the world. So when we're thinking about surrealism and thinking about like building a dream world, sometimes thinking about how like one object can represent many things at once can be a really cool thing to do in a painting. Like what happens when multiple ideas are embedded within one image. Here's a few more works by Max Ernst. These are a little bit different. So this one on the left feels, much more abstract. This one on the right, I think, there's so many interesting things happening here. There's such a interesting use of paint on the bottom here. There's figuration and narrative happening. There's this very well-rendered butt here. And then the sort of torso of this figure becomes clear and see-through, as well as the hands and the arms. So there's this really interesting breakdown of the figure and ground relationships, where here we can tell that this butt is in front of the landscape. But then here, with the upper half of this figure's body, it's like the background and the foreground, the relationships are skewed. Something new is happening, which leaves a lot of room for imagination and sort of raising a question of like, what does it mean when a landscape is like going through a person? And why is this person that look like they're dressed like a Roman soldier or something? But a lot of things to think about. Rene Magritte was a surrealist who also did a lot of thinking about figure-ground relationships. What happens when we take a silhouette of a person, put the silhouette in front of a curtain and allow the sky to exist as the person's silhouette? Here's a work by Leonora Carrington. Um, I'm pretty sure Leonora Carrington made this work. The so she was um, I think she was in her 90s when she painted this, and I think this was the year that she passed away. Um, and she was such an amazing painter. Wow. I love her work so much. So like the person riding this horse is this creature we've never seen before. So she's like inventing her own species of horses and creatures. There's a whole world being built here. um, while at the same time, her use of color, the sense of space, it's so vivid. There's not a lot of cast shadows. So light is a really interesting thing here. Like light, it's almost to me looks like each life form is its own light source. Like to me, it almost looks like this there's light emanating out of this person's um, head or whatever, or clothing, or like the trees themselves. It's almost like light is glowing from them. um, so yeah, you don't have to have a usual sense or logic of light or space or gravity in your painting, but you can control whatever is happening in the worlds that you build in your artwork. And I think it's really cool to see masterful examples of people doing so. At least it's really inspiring for me. Here's a few more by Leonora Carrington. Um, Gosh, I love this work on the left. It's so creepy and beautiful, and fabulous. Um, Kiki, this one reminds me a little bit of some of those works that you showed me. Um, I really love the use of drawing in this work as well as painting, where like line work, like the linear quality of these brushstrokes are really important. While at the same time, like what's going on with the background here? Like what kind of space is this? How deep does it go? What does it contain? There's like birds emerging in the space in the atmosphere that are so uh, subtle. It's almost like everything is also invisible or like ghostly. Um, like this figure, both of these figures here, we can see the background through the figure, which creates this sense of like an ephemeral figure and ground relationship, or relationship to our environment, where a figure, um, we can really sort of think about what is the relationship here between these figures and the space that they live in. Also, just like the invention of like these these creatures, these little like goblins, are so lovable. Um, and here's a work here titled "The Giantess." Um, I really love this work. And notice how she's using scale. So like just how tiny the people are down here, and how that really allows us to think about scale and think about this figure as a giantess. Um, she's doing amazing things. Um, So I also wanted to show you all some work by Dorothea Tanning. And she was actually married to Max Ernst for a while. Um, and here's a picture of Dorothea Tanning and Max Ernst in one of their studios together. I love a good art history romance. Um, and this is a work on the left by Dorothea Tanning titled The Temptation of St. Anthony. Um, but yeah, her work is really, really vivid. It has this really glowing sense of light. The light sense of light source and shadow is really clear. She's really working with traditional styles of creating landscape, while at the same time she's inventing things, and she's making things that exist as multiple things at once. So this clothing here on St. Anthony is also all of these bodies, these like female forms creating this fabric that's flowing through the air or being like swept away into the clouds. So it's both human form, fabric, and clouds all at once. Um, Art can do anything. Anything can happen in your art. But also just like the narrative building, I think is so interesting. Could look at this work in so many different ways. Here's another work by Dorothea Tanning. So like the rich reds and super soft green tones, um, that bright yellow that then sort of like leads us down the steps, as well as back into this room here where the yellow is glowing from. Um, the hair is floating off into space. Um, so this is an example of like gravity is functioning differently. Um, we don't have to adhere to the same rules of reality when we're painting. Um, at the same time, these figures here, these children, are partial. You know, they feel like they are partially sunflowers. You know, their clothing feels so organic. Um, there's so much happening here. Here's this work on the left is a self-portrait of Dorothea Tanning, made in 1942. Um, just notice like the rendering of the figure, the clothing, like look at that outfit, look at that monkey bird, look at the descending scale of the open doors that allow us to keep following ourselves or following something through the space. um, so such an interesting person to look at um, for interior space. Dorothea Tanning is an excellent person to look at for surreal uses of interior space. How things like doors or windows can lead us through space in unexpected and otherworldly ways. But also just like her skirt, it's like made of algae. It's like these poofy sleeves. I feel like Prince would wear these sleeves. And oh, this algae skirt, I want it. And then she also made soft sculpture. So um, soft sculpture, or that the sort of idea of making sculpture out of things that are fabric, wasn't really done very often back then. So she was really kind of like one of the first artists who was thinking about sewing as a form of fine art um, in this way. So she kind of like created her figures, some of the figures in her paintings out of fabric and stuffing. Um, I also wanted to mention and show you the works of Remedios Varo, she is definitely one of my top artists I will always go back to. Um, and kind of similar to in some of the Max Ernst paintings, there's that kind of like tonalist or really overarching sense of color that Lillian was talking about, where it's almost like one color is diffusing but also influencing everything else in the painting. Um, and I just love her work so much for her use of color, the vibrancy, her textures, but also just her narratives. I think one of my very favorite things is in this painting on the left is this vehicle that is also an egg, that's also like a purse, and but it's a mode of transportation. It has like an accordion like fan on the back that I imagine is functioning like a fish, like a fish's fin. um, it has like a clock here, or like a compass for navigation. It has what appears to be wings that allow it to float through the water, that are attached to this figure's um, sort of like overcoat here. So it's almost like the figure pulls on these strings in order to activate the mechanism of this moving um, boat, this mode of transportation that is completely invented, and just like so thoughtful and thought provoking. Um, while at the same time, I think weather and like the elements are always really important in her work. So this idea of like this cup of water that's like overflowing and spewing out, that it's almost like filling up the entire world. Um, and then this work on the right, where so much is taking place in this cloud that almost feels like it's emanating from this building, as well as these people coming out. Um, there's so many ways we can think about these, but these are really kind of like in relation to the title. um, microcosms or determinism. It's really about thinking about these huge ideas about existence, very existential. Um, and here's another work by Remedios Varo titled The Revelation of the Clockmaker. Um, Another very existential piece. um, I could look at this work for a really long time and discover new things about it. I love the billowing ceiling. The ceiling looks like it's made of cloth. Um, there's this orb entering the window that feels like maybe that's the revelation or relating to it. Also looks like a bell that's about to ring. Um, and this clockmaker is in the room with all of these giant clocks that are filled with other people um, existing in their rooms. It's so open to interpretation, and it's also so um, there's so many large ideas about thinking about time and space and the worlds that we exist in, and existence in general. Blows your mind. Here's another work by Remedios Varo titled Embroidering the Earth's Mantle, which is just so cool. Um, that there's this tower in which all of these embroiderers are are embroidering the world, you know? So she asked herself, what would it look like if the world was embroidered? Um, and so there's these eggs. There's a lot of egg imagery in surrealism. I think a lot of it is kind of like these ideas of like creation, um, and so you'll notice more surrealist works you look at, you will see a lot of eggs. um, but these ideas of like the world being created through embroidery, um, at the same time, look at these clouds, these just hazy, like scumbled clouds, drifting over top, and the way in which she painted these bodies of water within this fabric. It's like the earth is made of fabric. What a great idea. um, Another artist I want to show you is named Kay Sage. And she was another really incredible female surrealist, um, who was also thinking a lot about using um, imagery of like fabric or wood or something else in order to depict things that are more like geologic. So to me, this really looks like a geologic sort of shelf of some kind, but it's created out of piles of fabric and industrial objects and wood. The title being The Instant really kind of makes me think that this is like the moment that something is happening, something like revelatory, um, but also like the electrical beam or electrical poles in the distance. The fact that this feels like it's almost been broken open makes me think that it's almost like this dystopian world in which the land is made um, out of our things. um, and what happens when there's that instant where it breaks open? I don't know. That's just one take. But check out that sense of light. The way light is appearing to come through clouds in this very specific way, um, casting these beautifully dramatic shadows. It feels very Baroque or Italian Renaissance, while at the same time dealing with such thought-provoking subject matter. Here's another work by Kay Sage, and this one's titled Small Portrait. So again, thinking about almost like um, structural materials and fabric as like building a person. Um, I love the moment where it turns from like this almost gold. This fabric appears to turn to gold and then turn into hair. Um, just so beautiful. And I also love this piece because we can really get a sense of how it's painted, where it appears like she really went in there with those deep dark tones, but we can see in this fabric over here how it's relatively simple. She just has like a mid-tone down on the fabric and then a highlight or a light tone to produce that moment of like bright light um, hitting the shoulder. And here's another one by Kay Sage. Um, really interesting stuff. I love the sense of color in this and the yellow and purple combinations. And this also appears to be kind of like it almost looks like a computer chip. But I don't think computers were a thing then. Um, but it also looks like a tree. It's evocative of so many different things. And we can really imagine what this structure is or what it was. Maybe it's like the remnants of something, the remnants of a boat. Um, there's so many ways we can think about these pieces. While at the same time, they're so grounded in light and shadow, and gradients of color and light, and thinking about color and light as a way of um, really kind of like creating a expressive way of experiencing the image and the space, but also like the shadows are so grounding. Um, so Kay Sage's husband was named Yves Tanguy, and his work was really kind of functioning in similar ways in a lot of ways. So he had these really intense cast shadows a lot of the time in his works. While at the same time, you could imagine that his forms maybe were invented through automatism, like through that way of working, um, of just sort of like drawing almost thoughtlessly and then stepping back from it and giving it light, giving it shadow, giving it form, making more decisions about what it is. Um, and I just love Yves Tanguy's work. So vivid. Another work by Yves Tanguy. Um, the light and the shadow and the subtlety of the tones, but also the textures, like when you're working from imagination or from like something that's more automatic, you can really kind of imagine like what is the surface of the thing I'm trying to paint? What would it feel like? Um, is it soft or prickly? We can really use our imaginations in endless ways. And Yves Tanguy was really inspired by Giorgio de Chirico, um, who was, I believe, um, he was doing a lot of work before the Surrealist movement, or at least separate from it. But he ended up inspiring a lot of the Surrealists. Um, and just notice how the composition is taken up with these large blocks of shape and color, um, but also the sense of light is so dramatic. The sense of foreground, middle ground, and background is still very clear, but it's very kind of like brutalist in its composition. So I also wanted to show some works by David Alfaro Siqueiros, who was a Mexican muralist during the Mexican mural movement, which was primarily taking place in Mexico City. And his work was similar to a lot of the other Mexican muralists, were thinking a lot about social issues and thinking a lot um, about painting or art as a way of um, kind of giving a voice to the people in his country, or as a way of highlighting the importance of the voices of every single person. While at the same time, he's doing a lot of um, thinking about shape and line and space in this very automatic way. So while this wasn't part of the Surrealist movement necessarily, I imagine it was partially inspired by it. But this is actually like a concert hall. You can sit. So those are chairs. So just to get a sense of like the scale here. Um, and here's a few more works by Siqueiros. Um, such dynamic compositions. Um, so very much sort of unpacking um, and kind of like posing questions in the with the intention of creating social commentary um, about history as well as the present and the future, um, but social commentary along with um, moments of abstraction, or using surrealism as a way of imagining a world, whether it's reimagining or trying to represent a historical moment, or trying to imagine one in the future. Um, his work is so vivid. I love the way he paints metal. If anyone's ever painting any metal, for the last project, you should look at some Siqueiros for inspiration. I would just love this bronze um, sort of glow and light. Here's some works by Wadsworth Gerald. And so we're kind of moving from the Surrealist movement into more contemporary examples that are more responding to the, or potentially inspired by the Surrealist movement. So Wadsworth Gerald was making a lot of work in response to the civil rights movement. So I believe this is an image here of Angela Davis, and the title "Revolutionary." You can also see that the form, the human form, and the space around her is created by text. So it's like the text is embedded with color and variety and pattern, but it's also creating a sense of form and a sense of light. And we see that kind of repeated in his work, where he's really kind of like embedding this sense of vibrance, where like these people are like gems. There's like, the people have like embedded kind of like tapestries of like glowing color. So his work is just really inspiring to look at for a number of reasons, but really interesting and exciting to look at as far as like combining social issues of social justice with painting. Yeah, we could look at these for a really long time. There's another work by Wadsworth Gerald. So this is more of a an abstract example, while at the same time there are figures embedded. But you know, these patterns are very specific. So the patterns are taken from the artist's African heritage and embedded into the work. And I think it's important to note that whenever you're thinking about using pattern in your work, I think it's really important to think about context. Think about like, how do I, as this artist, relate to the pattern that I'm creating? Even if it's like purely for fun, sometimes I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, like, what is the context that it creates here? Because here in this work, it adds so much context and beauty and background to the work. But I also think it's really important for us each to think about context in our work. Here's some works by James Jean. James Jean is a contemporary artist who's an illustrator and a painter. He's a Taiwanese American artist who makes these beautiful, lush worlds, a lot of the time with figures, animals, plants that are all kind of like in harmony together. These are just so stunning. And I also wanted to just show you his.
I love how vivid the colors are.
Yeah, his colors are wicked. And I had to show you all his website just because there's so much for y'all to dig into. He's like a freaking master of color. Notice how like this tone here, the figure is made out of all of these tones that are very similar to each other. Like the dress is made out of tones that are very similar to each other in value, but just slightly different in hue, which creates this almost like vibration where we have to look at it even closer to get a sense of what we're looking at. But you know, sometimes like, you know, stealing a color scheme from an artist, there's no shame in that. James Jean, I think, could teach us all a lot about creating a color scheme. Oh, these logs. Creating a color scheme that is incredibly vivid, that allows color to function with value, and that also, you know, it's just like constantly rewarding the viewer. This painting titled Kindling, it's so vibrant. I love these, the way that these logs have these like just lush kaleidoscopic moments of color. They're like geodes and faces as well.